Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's my pleasure to introduce Magister Žiga Škorjans to you. Žiga is part of our team at the department. And he is a very specific case in a way, because he is not Austrian, he is Slovenian, but he studied in Austria. So he did not come to Vienna because of his job. Unfortunately, he did not come to Vienna because of his job, because he was already there. But fortunately, he was not only here in Vienna, but he was here with a very, very interesting profile. Žiga studied, as I mentioned, law in Vienna, but after having finished this in 2013, he worked for several years in practical legal work, in particular as a candidate lawyer between 2014 and 2017, and he even passed the Austrian bar exam in October 2017 before he decided to join us as one of the very earliest members of the team at the department. Since January 2018, he has been working now as a university assistant at our department, and he's therefore employee number, I don't know, 3 or 4 or something. So really in the low digits, and has been really decisive and most influential and important in shaping what we are doing here. Not only because of his personality, but also because of his research interests, which are mainly in data economy and in particular on movement of data and economical implementations and implications of free movement of data in Europe. And secondly, about technological innovations in the financial sector. So Žiga is the one in the team who is always asked when we start talking about blockchain and similar tendencies. And as everybody is talking about blockchain in the moment, you might imagine that he's really key in the team. But today, Žiga, you are here not so much because of your competence in these areas, but you are here because of your nationality, which is Slovenian, in order to give us an overview about the situation on Corona in Slovenia, both from a legal and from a day-to-day perspective. Great to have you here, Žiga. Thank you for coming. So if you want to describe the status quo in Slovenia at the moment, how would you describe it?
So hi, first, thank you for having me. The situation in Slovenia is relatively stable, I must say, and comparable to the situation in Austria. Let me describe this with a couple of figures. So up to today, 1,200 people were tested positive with the new virus, and 61 people died. If you compare these numbers with Austrian numbers, which is you just multiply them by 4, because Slovenia has 2 million people, inhabitants, 2 million residents, and Austria 8, you would come to numbers that are slightly lower than those in Austria, but which remain in the same area, I would say. They're broadly comparable. The daily life is, as you would imagine, somewhat different than what we would usually have in normal circumstances. So we would have all sorts of government measures in place that are preventing social contacts, like public events and are cancelled, public institutions are closed. You would have bans on what goods may be sold to consumers. So shops would be closed except for those that cover the basic needs. And then you would have absolute ban on visiting retirement homes, and you would have special times when retirees and other critical groups may enter shops, so they are not exposed to the broader population. All sort of measures like this. And of course, universities are closed and they are doing e-learning. So my cousins who are studying in Slovenia are all about studying over Zoom now. So schools are closed. Healthcare is limited. This is pretty much comparable to Austria, I would say, but a long way from normal. And of course, the big concern in the area is what happens to our summer holidays.
Yes, when you say that your cousins are studying at the moment, so and that they do a lot using Zoom and similar tools, do you have the impression that the educational system was prepared or better prepared than other educational systems in the world, or is it just the situation comparable also in that sense, which means that universities and schools still need some time, or needed at least some time to adapt?
Yes, I think they were not particularly well prepared for it. But then you would have this difference between primary and secondary schooling and the universities, because universities managed quite quickly to put at least video conferencing tools in place, and Slovenian universities haven't. So they are doing most of the lectures live. So the time slot would be the same as before. And they do it live. And from what I hear, there has not been a big delay in the lectures, or they still plan to do the exams in this semester and so forth. So it hasn't been a waste of time, let's say like this. So the semester will not be lost. On the other hand, this primary schools and secondary schools are quite different because of sometimes because of the difficulty to implement the IT tools in the teaching there. So if you imagine the first classes of the primary schools, there's quite little that you can do. And in fact, for the last months, there was very little that was done. In secondary school, I would say it's a mixture between the poles of primary school and university. So they have managed to do some things, and they're going to still have the big exams in the end of the year. So the graduation exams, matura, this is still going to happen, although in a limited version of itself.
Yeah, so even this is quite similar to what Austria is doing at the moment, because the matura at the moment, at least, is still planned. And my daughter, who is in her last year of studies, is preparing now for going back to school early May for 3 weeks, and then having her final exam, her matura, in a very reduced way. So quite similar then. One difference, as far as I saw it when I prepared this talk, by using the material that you kindly provided and that are in the show notes of this. One difference that I learned was that public transport is completely closed, if I'm not mistaken. So how do people then manage to get from A to B?
So the public transport is completely closed since mid of March. Meaning this is the transport of people, not the transport of goods. Transport of goods, of course, is still operating.
Yes.
One would imagine there would be a huge public outcry because of this closure, and huge pressure from the public to reopen it. Both of this is conspicuously absent from the current situation. This can be explained by the mixture of a couple of grounds that are applicable here. So the first reason would be that, of course, the biggest city in Slovenia is Ljubljana, which is slightly bigger than Graz, and so most of the country does not rely on public transport on a daily basis. So, for example, in my hometown, Celje, with approximately 50,000 residents, you would have a couple of bus lines operating usually. And even this is rather a novelty, because they began operating again only a year or two ago, and they didn't operate for several years before. So most people get around by car. The second reason why this is not so problematic, or not discussed as problematic now, is that everybody is so that at least a half of population is in home office, which then reduces the problem of commuting. And also there is one big exception that is also a bit different from what we have in Austria. And this is the exception that people might commute in groups up to 5 if they're commuting together to work or from work. So if you have one car and 5 people commute to work in that car and back home, this is exempt from the restrictions that are otherwise in place. So and this going to work together by car is even in normal circumstances much more widespread and important for commuting than public transport, at least over longer distances. So if you would forbid that, the impact would be much higher. So it was not as difficult to cancel public transport as it would be to do so in a larger city like Vienna.
Yes, I see. But this commuting together from a social distancing point of view is, of course, not really the best thing you would do, right? Bring 5 people together in one car, and each of them then going back to their families. I mean, but
yes,
yeah.
This is where. Of course, this is a critical point that it has been discussed. I assume this was considered as a necessary evil to keep things operating. Because obviously, if you would then put each person in a separate car, then problems arise with people who don't have a car, or not everyone has a car, and you would then need maybe public transport and good public transport, and all sorts of problems would arise. So I think this is something everybody was aware of. The official argumentation would probably be their co-workers anyway, and would be in contact with one another, because if they didn't absolutely need to go to work, they would have been in home office. And if they all have to be in work, then they probably also have to be in contact with another, like salespeople in stores or medical staff and so forth, right?
Yes.
But it is a weak link in all these measures that were put in place, right? Because some of them were very strict, and so, for example, we all have to wear facial masks for stores in Austria now, but in Slovenia this was implemented quite a while ago, and they also implemented at that stage the limited number of people who can enter a store. So they started to limit that quite early on. And also you were obliged to wear gloves when you went into a store, right? So this last part was cancelled a week ago or so, but still it was quite, the impact of other measures was quite severe. So going together to work might see as an obvious way to prevent further spread of disease, but it was not limited.
What I really find striking in all these many conversations is how different European Union member states deal with this, right? So this wearing gloves obligation is something that I didn't meet anywhere before. And the facial mask story is also very interesting because, as you certainly know, because you were here in Vienna, then the official policy of this government was for quite some time that facial masks would not be needed. And you simply cross one border and the situation is completely different. Isn't that striking? I mean, it's unbelievable.
This is striking. Primarily, I mean, the fact that you have to consider is that the cultural background is relatively similar, right? So none of our societies is used to wearing masks. And then the speed with which such draconian measures from a cultural point of view were put in place in Slovenia was much higher than somewhere in Austria, or I mean, there are other countries who still are not. Yes. I mean, if you look to Germany, they're still avoiding it as a big taboo, and this is quite similar. The other thing that is also interesting is how people in different countries reacted differently to the prohibitions that were put in place, right? So, I mean, how much control was needed to survey them, and how large the percentage of the population was who obeyed these measures strictly, right? Because what I find striking is how many people put themselves into a position to reinterpret what measures were imposed, or how do you live with these measures, right? So we all know examples of people going to visit one another and say they kept the distance all the time. But of course, this is not the way that our governments imagined the social distancing to be implemented, right?
Yes, true. Were there any supply problems when it came to the mask story? Because one of the explanations that I read about this was that there was simply no masks available on the market, and that would, of course, have triggered quite some rumors then. So did that work out?
So at the time, as this obligation to wear a mask was imposed in Slovenia, there, of course, this was quite early on, and there was still huge problems with access to proper protection. So it was never imposed as an obligation to wear a mask as of itself a mask, a medical mask, so you could have worn a scarf or something like that. So something that covers your nose and mouth. So there was not a huge outcry, and the measure had probably the intended consequences. But of course, this was pointed out several times. We need medical protection gear if we want to implement such measures. And even today, in Austria, it is the case that the masks are distributed in the shops, or you can at least easily buy them for a small price, right? This is still not the case in Slovenia. So if you would go into a normal store, they wouldn't be handing out masks. They would be expecting you to have masks.
Interesting, because one of the differences that I learned was that, different from Austria, the government is in a rather different situation at the moment in Slovenia, because there was a change in the government quite recently, which is always triggering, I mean, a specific era in politics. And that's probably not the best moment to be hit by such a wave for a government. So do you think that the government is supported by the population, and these measures are supported by the population, although there are supply problems, for example? Or are we in a phase where this newly I call it now elected, because it's not technically, it's not elected, but it's in power now, this newly in power government is no longer, or loses popularity? So how would you put this?
So firstly, to go back to the supply problems, those have been significantly alleviated in the last 2 weeks, I would say. Secondly, to the government itself, it came to the change of the parliamentary majority, right? So no new elections. And even the outgoing government was in power when the Corona situation arose. So they were putting first measures in place, or doing at least the baby steps, and then the government changed, and they imposed the more strict version of the measures. This was probably driven by the developments in Italy or in Austria, in Tyrol, and so forth. So it was clear to everyone early on that that Slovenia might be severely affected by new virus, due to the fact that these regions that were heavily infected are the main touristic regions that Slovenians visit in winter. So this is why probably they reacted quite strictly in the beginning. As to the public support of the government, it is difficult to say, because the government was thrown into the situation, and they even swore in wearing protective masks, which is quite a hilarious photo if you Google it. It is difficult to say if the government has lost a majority due to the measures it has taken. I think the population, or at least the large majority of the population, would subject itself to such measures, even if it was a different government imposing them, due to the fact that they at least seemed as necessary at the time that they were imposed. And we will see the government is still within its first 90 days. So we will see how the popularity develops afterwards. I think one key element might be how the measures are going to be eased, and how well that works, and if the second wave might be prevented, and of course how the next few months are going to be, if the normality settles in or not. So this might be a large milestone on how this government is going to be measured. Yes, yeah. But this is not to say that it hasn't been without growing pains, right? Because the whole new setup, at least from the personnel, had to be put in place, and this brings its challenges and difficulties in the normal of times.
Yeah, absolutely, because every member of the government needs to come to hire new people, needs to enter office, needs to speak with the existing staff on administrative procedures and all this. And doing this in such a crisis must be very challenging. But can I perhaps ask you about the legal quality of all these measures? Are they decided and published by the government, or are they based on a law?
So some of the decrees that are imposed on on weekly basis, right? That have most of these measures that are imposed by decree. Some of them are put in place by the government. Some are put in place by the Ministry of Health. So by the Minister of Health. They all are decrees with the force of law. And the legal situation is at least the one the decrees that are put in place by the Minister of Health have a clear legal basis in Communicable Diseases Act. The decrees that are put in place by the government have a bit, I would say, less clear legal basis, because the legal basis cited is the Government of Republic of Slovenia Act, so the act that regulates what government may or may not do, and there, of course, there are provisions what government may do in the times of crisis, right? So this would not. So this is the basis that they use for it. What we have to say is that such decrees with force of legal acts, with force of law, they have basis in the Constitution, right? So there is an article in the Constitution explicitly regulating what the state of emergency is. Then there is an article regulating this kind of decrees, right? So there are legal bases in place. And if you think about Slovenian Constitution, it was modeled on the German Constitution. So the structure would be the same. I'm not sure about the understanding of every aspect if it is the same, but the basic structure is the same, so it functions in the same way. You would have part of the Constitution regulating human and citizens' rights, then you would have the part that is about the organization of the state and so forth. And within you would have also this article about decrees with the force of law, which is a bit different, because you would have then this would actually be a third legal basis, because it is only applicable in events where the National Assembly is unable to adjourn, which is obviously not the case now. So you would still have this control. Yes, but please.
No. I mean, the question I would have is the parliament still working? So do the members of the parliament still come together? And question two, is the opposition supporting the measures, or is there a political debate about what's happening?
So firstly, the parliament is coming together, and apart from these day-to-day measures that were mostly imposed by decree, the big, let's say, stimulus measures for the economy and so forth, so the economic side of the measures, they were introduced by a normal law. So parliament is working in a limited way, but still they are coming together, and these laws are issued in the normal procedure. So then you would obviously have this parliamentary control, so checks and balances, right? The opposition has been quite cooperative, I would say. There hasn't been much. So the public debate about the measures, of course, you would have debate about the necessity of the measures or about the style of the public presentation or something like that. So, the debate is not muted, far from it, but you would not have this, let's say, contrarian actions of the opposition that you might expect in normal times if such strict measures would be imposed. This is because I think that if you look at the measures imposed, the core of it would be something that most people in the parliament would agree on. So they are not they're not so contentious, right?
Yeah. And there is no debate or concern about the obvious limitations of fundamental rights coming with all these measures.
So the most extraordinary limitations to fundamental rights would come in the form of the aforementioned decrees from the Ministry of Health or from the government itself directly, right? So the first, why is this even possible, right? So Slovenia declared the epidemic based on the Communicable Diseases Act, which enables the Ministry of Health then to issue these decrees. And this was done following basically the recommendation of the World Health Organization. So after World Health Organization declared an epidemic or pandemic, then the National Institute of Public Health followed suit and declared epidemic from Slovenia, which was the legal basis to trigger these powers in the law. So this was not this was not contentious. This was not really a point of huge public debate, at least in the main media, right? So if you would go into the blog sphere or Twitter sphere, you would see also more critical or more cynical comments to it. But it wasn't hugely contentious, and mostly I would say it wasn't. What I look at is not always what just the opposition is doing, because the opposition might be was in power at the beginning of the crisis, so they have maybe have some vested interest in some of the measures, right? So I'm looking at what the civil society groups would be doing, and there also has not been a huge outcry, right? So there has been a petition about why such severe restriction of movement have been put in place, but this was wasn't treated as seriously by mainstream media because, well, it's obvious why restrictions of movement would put in place. But you would not have like civil liberty groups going out in numbers and criticizing the measures. So this fear that this might turn into a permanent state or something is firstly not there, because the parliament is working as usual. So the parliamentary control is still there, and because constitutional court is in place, and in the next session they will hear some cases that challenge the measures that have been put in place, and there is no real sign that this might turn into a permanent state or something like this. So the constitutional part of this debate has been quite muted or barely present, right? Except for some very technical questions. Please.
No, and different from Austria, the cases that are brought to the Constitutional Court so far are brought there by individuals. So it's not the opposition, because one of the things that happened now here is that one of the opposing parties, I mean, it was not in front of the Constitutional Court, but it is in front of the Data Protection Authority, the Datenschutzbehörde, asked for the check of one of the measures or one of the initiatives that are undertaken here in Austria on this Corona app by the Red Cross, by the FPÖ, is now challenged in front of the Data Protection Authority. So this did not happen yet in Slovenia, up to your knowledge, that opposing parties use instruments of law to fight politically against some of the measures.
No, so as of yesterday, when I last checked, it was still not public information who actually filed these complaints to the Constitutional Court. This might be due to several reasons. I haven't exactly looked into it, but this will be lifted as the order of proceedings for the next session are going to be made public. So, but no political party has, let's say, claimed responsibility for themselves. And I mean, going to Constitutional Court is one thing. It is a very legitimate thing to do, right? And I can imagine that a lot of business measures put in place will be challenged in the Constitutional Court. But instrumentalizing other authorities like Data Protection Authority was an Austrian novelty, I must say. I haven't heard this before, right? So, so the Information Commissioner in Slovenia is, up to my knowledge, has not been used by any political party in the current situation in order to exert some pressure on the government or something like that.
Yeah, and you also told me that the reason for this Data Protection Authority initiative here in Austria, which is an app, is not really on the daily agenda in Slovenia yet, right? So there is no development that could be challenged by such a measure.
No, so an app solution is a fourth pillar, I would say, of measures that might then prevent a second wave of infections has not really been discussed.
No
why?
Drones either. Drones, for example, or video surveillance on the streets.
No, I think some drones were already used for patrolling of the borders before, but not in urban areas. This was not discussed. So videos from China where a drone tells a person to go home and do this later. This is not on the daily agenda, right?
Yeah.
So
and
no, this
also not as a fear. I mean, it's not. It's there are no concerns officially announced by, I don't know, a party or an NGO or an academic.
This has not been widely discussed. So the use of technology was not one of the top priorities for handling the crisis up to yet. I don't know if this is due to limited resources or to the hastiness that has to do with the change of the government, because I mean, you need the resources in place and teams in place in order to start developing apps. And there's private initiative like from the Red Cross in Austria was also not put in place. So this is not high on the agenda. So in Slovenia, we had an offline measure that is still stirring up the most dust and most discussion. This was what was featuring in our media as prominently as apps in Austrian media, which is of course very different, right? And also very severe limitation of personal right to movement, right, and other freedoms as well. But it had this. There are some justifications for doing it, for imposing this strict measure, right, and which was not imposed in the first wave of measures, but was then a reaction to the fact that for 2 weekends in a row, the beaches and the mountains were full with day tourists.
Yeah. And it's enforced simply by policemen asking you who you are and where you're living, and then checking this with a database in the background, or
this is in principle it is enforced like you described, as every policeman in traffic that would pull you over and check the documents could enforce it. In practice, I don't hear from anyone, and I know quite few people who are commuting on daily basis that this would be it would be strictly enforced, right? So you can read that there were some fines that were issued, but I do not know. It's not specifically stated if it was for this restriction specifically or for any other. So I would not say that there is police on the street enforcing this any more than all the other laws. So it is, but I think that the signal that this sent out, right, was loud and clear, and the majority of the population has heard it, and so it became better, right? So this.
Yeah, which brings me to another question, which I find very striking, which is the situation at the borders, in particular the situation to the Austrian border, which is a long story in a way. I mean, it did not start with this crisis, that the European idea of free flow of people and services, etc., is quite intensely challenged when it comes to borders. Is there any public debate about this in Slovenia that you are aware of and that you would like to report?
Way back when the border was closed, of course, there was public debate, and the arguments about how European it is to close borders were brought up. But this is all due to the previous crisis, which was the migration crisis, right?
Yes.
So, of course, this was then in a part debated quite loudly. The criticism of Austria was not as strong because Slovenia followed suit and closed the and is more strictly patrolling the border to Croatia and now on the border to Italy. So it is some sort of a chain reaction that you get if one border gets closed, right? So you would probably, if Bavaria closes border, you would have border closures to Greece all the way. So this is a chain reaction, and this is problematic from many viewpoints, and it is not the most European concept you can imagine. the benefits of it might be debated. But in the public debate now, the special situations about the corona and increased closure of border crossings. So because there's several border crossings that are open between Slovenia and Austria, but this is not all the border crossings. And I think the times are limited in a way. And of course, you would have measures on both sides of the border. So temperature being measured, going into quarantine if you want to cross, and then the exceptions for people crossing on daily basis and so forth. This was not really politicized because, so at least from internally, yes, but the relations to Austria, not as much, because this is a situation we now have on all borders. And I even think that Slovenia closed the border to Italy before Austria did. So you cannot really criticize your neighbor for doing what you've done before. So this would be the important. So the question that is asked now more and more frequently, but has not really been answered in any suitable way, is when do we start relaxing the closures of the borders? So when the quarantine. So the quarantine was reduced from 14 days to 7 days in Slovenia after border crossing. This was done quite recently, but any other easing of measures has not been discussed up to this point, probably because there is need for coordination between, at least between the neighboring states or the rest of the EU, right? But this is something that is going to get more and more critical as the other measures are being eased. And I'm not aware of any suitable answer in Austria or in Slovenia as well. I mean, but the public, I would assume this is something very of great importance to the public, right? Something that they would be of high interest in the following months.
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely. And again, this is something which is really striking, that Slovenia simply cuts the period of quarantine in half, is something I never heard before, and is quite different from what I hear from other countries, right? Yes. And it's, I mean, from everything I know, the infection period can be up to 10 or 12 days even. I think that's what they think at the moment. So that a quarantine of 7 days, I mean, it's an interesting approach again, right? Yes. So either it's not true that it's 12 days, or you decide to take a risk that people who are infected are not in quarantine when they might spread the disease. So that's weird, isn't it? I mean, that we don't debate this in Europe in a way, right? Because it's not only in Slovenia the problem.
I think this has to do with the availability of testing, because the period is reduced to 7 days if you get tested and get a negative result. Otherwise, it's still 14 days. But in majority of cases, at least to what was reported in the media, this testing is available. So this would be, of course, how many tests you would need is a different question. One might think you would need a large number of them, but this probably is not the case, because people who are willing to go into quarantine for 1 week and would even have to prove where they can be in quarantine, right? The number of them would be very limited. So this would be, very, very few people coming home very late in the crisis or something like this. But it is true. I mean, I would also expect that there would be some, at least on the EU level, some more clarity about these rules, because right now, just checking what is allowed in one country and another, and then of course we follow the media where they describe what was done in Austria, in Germany, in France, and so forth, and then you mix it up together, and then it's hard to know what is applicable. So some sense of unifying these measures, at least those that are relevant to the cross-border issues, would make a lot of sense, at least when you're trying to open the borders again, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So the good news of this is that there will be plenty of work for lawyers also on this. But the bad news is all this is very costly, and it's and the target is moving unbelievably quickly. So it's very hard to keep track of what's happening in 27 different member states. Giga, I really appreciate all this input. I would, however, like to come slowly to an end by asking our audience to ask any questions or give any comments if you would like to in the next minutes or so, because I will ask probably my final question, which is, Giga, if you think about your daily life in Vienna and Austria at the moment, with your cultural and national background, is there anything that is really strange for you? I mean, things that Austrians do very, very differently than you would expect things to be? Or is everything so culturally close that it's more or less like life in Ljubljana that you are in at the moment?
On the daily basis, I would not expect the differences to be very huge between Ljubljana and Vienna right now, because most people are staying indoors and so forth. The two differences that I would point out are, of course, Vienna still has public transportation, and it now can be used for free time, so for spending free time in other places. The second would be what I think would explain this measure to limit movement to the municipality of permanent residents, right? It was that I would imagine that the number of people who were following the measures strictly at the beginning was slightly higher in Vienna, from what I hear, because there are a couple of zones in Vienna, Prater, on Donauinsel, where you would have reports that some measures were not really observed. In Slovenia, this was done on a slightly larger scale, as I've mentioned, with day tourism, right? Although I think now everybody has understood that this is not a short crisis when we go home for 2 weeks, but this is going to be a midterm situation that we'll have to deal with on a more profound basis. And so I would think that life as it is now is quite similar. And I wouldn't say the differences are necessarily cultural, except the differences that come out now are mostly driven, I think at least, by the measures that are implemented and the public debate around them. So if the data protection issues are more discussed in Austria due to the fact that there are apps that are on the market for preventing corona, this would then not, for me, as of itself, signalize that Austrians are more concerned with the data protection than Slovenians, because in Slovenia this is not discussed, as no apps are broadly available, and vice versa. I wouldn't say that Austrians would not would not consider not to implement some measures as strictly as maybe the government would imagine, as Slovenians didn't in the beginning, because this is something that is also then as well how we react about it, right? So the cultural differences that come out in the crisis haven't been as big as one might expect, right? So everything for now seems under control in both places. At least this is the hopeful view of an optimist that I am.
Yeah, indeed. So let's hope that this is a proper assessment of the situation. Giga, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate this. No questions in the live blog at the moment. So it's up to me now to thank you once again. Thank you to our audience. Stay tuned. We will have another interview like this one on Monday about the situation in the United Kingdom with our staff and friend Emily Johnson. And on Tuesday next week, the UN Special Rapporteur for the Right to Privacy, Joe Kanatachi, will join us. So plenty of things to see. Thank you to all of you for your time. Enjoy the weekend, stay safe and stay healthy. Thank you. Take care. Thank you, Giga, again.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.